Hello everybody, my name is Kate Halls. This is the second video I have made specifically for my website, A Teacher Speaks, because I cannot stay silent any longer about what is happening in education in New Zealand. My previous video talked about the daily lives of teachers and the stresses they face, but this is different. This is about the direction that I believe education is being taken in by our current coalition government. What is happening in education in Aotearoa right now is concerning, not just to teachers, not just to Māori, but to everyone. This video is my way of trying to get some information out without me simply ranting in the staff room or posting on Facebook. I've tried to take snips of sources where possible. I tried not to have a news site bias, but I will note that The Guardian and BBC News both had excellent searchable histories for education news stories. Everything I say in this video is searchable online, with the exception of one comment, which I will address as I go through this video. So who am I? For those who don't know me, I'm a teacher who lives on the west coast of New Zealand. I'm originally from Wales. I was born and raised in Wrexham and went to two state schools, Ysgol Bryn Offa, which is now closed, and Ysgol Rhywaben. I passed my A-levels and went to study at Lancaster University. I got my BA Honours and my MA, and then I trained as a teacher at St Martin's College. I took a few years out after teaching and went to work behind the scenes in education projects, like the Lancashire County Council School Improvement Service, the Playing for Success education project at Deepdale Stadium in Preston, and the North West Universities Association, which was based in Manchester. I returned to teaching in 2010 through a programme which supported vulnerable teenagers in northwestern England. The programme focused on life skills and offered a pathway towards army selection. It was run by ex-officers. It aimed to get teenagers who were not in employment, education or training into the forces or into employment. I taught the English curriculum aspects of this programme. I started in January 2010, and in May 2010 I watched as the Conservative Party and Liberal Democrat Party formed a coalition government following a general election. The following year, that programme I was working on had its funding slashed. Funding was cut back for the armed forces, and we were a casualty. This was the beginning of almost a decade and a half of Conservative government rule in the UK. And the effect that this has had on education across the UK has been devastating. I personally lay a lot of the blame for this at the feet of one man, Michael Gove. Michael Gove was a Conservative Member of Parliament who served as the Secretary of Education from 2010 to 2014. He became the architect of many of the education policies that have reshaped state education in the UK into a quasi-privatised affair. Indirectly, he's now having an impact on what is happening in the education system in Aotearoa, New Zealand. July 2022, our Prime Minister, Chris Luxon, went to meet Michael Gove in the UK. He described and praised his education reforms as brilliant. It's worth noting that when I went looking for the source of this quote, Christopher Luxon's Facebook page has been deactivated, so while I could find the photograph of him and Michael Gove, I couldn't verify the quote. However, if you want to know what's potentially coming in Aotearoa's education system, you need to understand what Michael Gove put into place in the UK. As Education Secretary, Michael Gove oversaw the expansion of academies. An academy is a school which is not controlled or funded by the local education authority. Their funding is not ring-fenced, and they are given an open budget to spend as they wish. They are not required to follow the national curriculum, nor to hire teachers with formal education qualifications or qualified teacher status. Alongside the expansion of academies, Gove also proposed that parents and charities should be able to form new state-funded type of school, a free school. directly funded by the government without any requirement to hire qualified staff, offer qualifications such as GCSEs, or follow the national curriculum. They also had autonomy over their term length and the length of their school day. Shortly after becoming Education Secretary in 2010, Gove announced plans for schools that were rated outstanding to become academies. The outstanding grade is awarded by the Office for Standards in Education, or Ofsted, the quasi-autonomous government organisation responsible for maintaining and raising standards in education. They award gradings to teachers and schools on a 4-point grading system based on unannounced visits and inspections. The 4 grades at this time were outstanding, good, satisfactory, and inadequate. The best and brightest examples of state education were being encouraged to move away from government oversight and control. Once the initial framework was in place, Gove started working towards revamping the national curriculum. It was restructured. One of the first things to go was the mandatory study of any writer who was not British. Gove wanted the curriculum to focus on British writers and British history. The seeds of nationalism and exclusionism were already sown into the education system. A stronger focus on English language, particularly phonics and structured literacy, and mathematics was now demanded. Students who could not write with fluent grammar and punctuation were now penalised in GCSE examinations outside of the English ones. In 2012, Ofsted made changes to their assessment and grading system. The third tier, previously rated satisfactory, was now rebranded as requires improvement. We'll come back to this moment a little later on in this video. September 2012, Gove announced plans to move away from GCSEs, creating a new qualification called the English Baccalaureate. This would feature maths, English, science, a humanities subject, and a language. The new system would cut back on classroom-based assessment and coursework and mandated end-of-year exams as the primary form of assessment. There was outcry from arts and technology teachers across the country. Schools began deprioritising arts and practical tech subjects in preparation for this new theory-based assessment. The scale of the proposed changes was overwhelming. Eventually, even the Education Select Committee said that this was too much, too fast. Plans for this reform were eventually dropped in February 2013. March 2013, over 100 academics wrote a joint letter to Michael Gove criticising the reforms in the curriculum, stating that there was now too much emphasis on memorising facts and rules and an over-reliance on rote learning. A stinging letter to The Independent criticised his blinkered messianic self-belief in his reforms. It pointed out that he had ignored the expertise and wisdom of teachers, head teachers, advisors and academics who he claimed to have consulted. Gove's response was to quip that there is good academia and bad academia. In 2014, as part of a reshuffle, Gove was removed from his post as Secretary of Education. He was described as a toxic liability to the profession after teacher unions held votes of no confidence in his abilities and performance. Teachers cheered across the country when Gove was removed from his post, but the damage had already been done and the rot had already set in. From 2014 to 2016, Nicky Morgan took over as Education Secretary. It's worth noting that one of the early aspects of her job was facing questions about financial management and mismanagement in academies. To control some of these issues, it was proposed that academies should form multi-academy trusts, groups of schools overseen by one central organisation, sometimes a lead school. Schools who had converted into academies to get more freedom from government control were now faced with being placed into trusts, also outside of government control, who could mandate their curriculum and policies. It was around this time that it became apparent that once a school had converted into academies, there was no process in place for them to convert back into a local education authority maintained school. Once converted, they were stuck, with no route back to their old structure. In 2016, Nicky Morgan made way for Justine Greening to become Education Secretary. She was a big fan of free schools and wanted to see more of them forming, as well as being a fan of more state funding being given to the creation of new grammar schools, academically selective schools that are state funded but for whom entrance is restricted to an academic elite, selected by examination, predominantly at the age of 11. This academic elite were usually students in middle-class areas who took tests that were based on middle-class cultural capital. A thriving industry exists in the UK of tuition services who help to coach students to prepare for these exams. They are not an equitable form of selection for students from less economically advantaged backgrounds. In 2018, another new Education Secretary took over, Damien Hinds. He oversaw some of the most destructive reforms in terms of school autonomy and choice and self-determination. He used the new Ofsted third rating requires improvement to legally force schools to convert to academies within multi-academy trusts. These were legally termed forced conversions. Any school rated at a 3 was given 12 to 18 months to improve. If a second inspection received the same grade, they would be forced to convert and join a multi-academy trust. In the UK education system, 80% of secondary schools are now academies. A 2018 LSE report into the impact of academisation notes that academies within a multi-academy trust do not have autonomy. MATs may seek to standardise the schools they run, giving less freedom and flexibility than the schools enjoyed when they were maintained. Research has found that most MATs prescribe the curriculum to at least some extent. In January 2018, I left the UK and came to work in New Zealand after 8 years working in the adult education sector. I helped hundreds of adults to gain qualifications in English and maths. They had all left school without these. The pass rate of people entering my programs of instruction was 0%. By the time they left, my pass rate was 95%. What this told me was that there was no issue with any of these people learning maths, English, or ICT skills, but there was a big problem with the state of their education countrywide. I worked in Cumbria, Lancashire, all of Yorkshire, Manchester, Merseyside, Nottinghamshire, Lincolnshire, Birmingham, Derbyshire, Staffordshire, Cheshire, and Shropshire. These were issues that were spread across huge areas, not idiosyncrasies of an individual catchment area. In 2024, 71% of 16-year-olds gained a qualification in GCSE English. 72% gained a qualification in maths at GCSE level. This means roughly 3 out of 10 students leave school without qualification in English, and almost 3 out of 10 leave school without qualification in maths. My opposition to charter schools in New Zealand is well known. I've stated in multiple meetings and at conferences that I literally moved 12,000 miles across the world to avoid having to work in this education system. I am beyond dismayed to see that it is following me to New Zealand. But it is not a surprise that New Zealand is now facing a system where the following things are beginning to happen. ERO are becoming a more judgmental and punitive organisation, with stricter inspection criteria for teachers and schools. The first time ERO came to visit my school, there was no stress. I barely even noticed they'd been and gone. We did exactly what we did every day, and maybe the senior management were concerned, but no stress was passed on to the teachers. We just got on with our jobs. But it's a different ballgame now. The subject of ERO is raising its head in every department meeting, with greater focus on planning and embedding, and for the first time since I left the UK, The notion of being observed in class by an outside inspector has been mentioned. This is not a change in attitude that I welcome. I went through several Ofsted inspections when I worked in the UK. The impact on my health and the health of my colleagues was awful. It's one of the most stressful periods of my life, not one that I am keen to repeat. The Ministry of Education has now removed control of the teaching standards from the quasi-autonomous Teaching Council. I'm not a fan of the Teaching Council. I think it needs to be smaller. It needs to have less remit. It would be better to focus on a smaller list of tasks. But this does not mean I welcome these standards being moved to the Ministry of Education. I do not want this ministry and this coalition government deciding what makes me an effective teacher. Our curriculum is being revamped. Again, we're facing the third major change in recent years. Concerns have been raised about the content, the level, the recolonisation and the speed of the implementation. That's before I even bring myself to talk about the comments from our current Deputy Prime Minister about how the history curriculum has now been fixed and how references to Maori history are gone. Our assessment system is also being revamped. There's a focus on external exams, less coursework, more focus on literacy and numeracy, less time and space in the curriculum for arts and technology and other practical subjects. As part of this proposal, it was also acknowledged that the literacy and numeracy requirements will progressively get more difficult as they are aligned to the new curriculum and assessment model. As this is a key metric for judging the performance of schools, this is causing concern. I'm sure by now you can see the parallels between the changes that are being proposed for Aotearoa and the changes that were brought in under Michael Gove in the UK education system. School boards are now being told that they no longer have a legal requirement to meet the obligations of Te Tiriti o Waitangi. More and more charter schools are being opened under models which resemble free schools. Not only are new ones being opened, organisations and community groups are being encouraged to bid to take over existing state schools and convert them into charter schools against the will of the boards of trustees and the staff. This is awfully reminiscent of the forced conversions of state schools into academies in the UK. We're seeing more discussions in the press about schools not meeting standards and the need for greater intervention. My prediction is, like the schools that were rated inadequate or requires improvement in the UK, this punitive judgment model will lead to schools being forcibly converted into charter schools, with other established ones taking a lead role in a structure reminiscent of the multi-academy trust model in place in the UK. In the wake of a poorly implemented and more challenging curriculum, this is an issue that will continue to grow. It is a manufactured crisis which I believe has one aim: the mass conversion of New Zealand state schools into a charter school system. And in the face of all of this, I would like to remind you of two things. The first being that in 2022, Christopher Luxon met with Michael Gove and described his vision for education as brilliant. And the second being that 80% of secondary schools in the UK are now academies, funded by the state and controlled by external trusts. This is not accidental. This is a deliberate plan. And while I understand that a lot of secondary teachers believe that organisations such as our teaching union should be focused solely on the industrial negotiations that are ongoing, we cannot afford to take our eye off the wider educational issues that are happening around us. The speed of this process has left me stunned. I firmly believe that this coalition government are trying to rush through all of these reforms so that they can have them in place and locked into existence before the general election happens in 2026. We are still a democracy, though. It is time to make our voices heard. That is my reason behind making this video. I couldn't sit by and say nothing and watch these parallels continue. This is my effort, poor as it might be, to spread the word and get more people aware of what is going on. We have got to push back about this if we value our state education system in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I will be devoting considerable energy to this. I find that it is possible to care about more than one thing in education at a time. We have to. I invite you to join me. Please, please do.